we'll go ahead and get started. I'll ask you if you have a cell phone to please put it on silent before the panel begins. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming to New Queers Eve, the LGBT Clay, one of several panels this year at NCECA that addresses ideas of identity in clay. I'm so honored to be able to introduce this panel and can just say that a panel like this has been a long time coming. My name is Kelly Knoll, and I'm an associate professor of art at Carleton College in Minnesota, where I met the panel's moderator, Dustin Yeager, in 2004, when he was a junior in college and I was one of 3 out faculty at my institution. And I feel like we were meant to meet each other then, and the relationship that we have now as peers is just something I cherish beyond belief. I attended my first NCECA conference 27 years ago, and at that time, celebrating diversity in ceramics meant making room for both sculptors and potters on Ceramics Monthly magazine cover. I don't recall exactly the year, but I think it was probably in 1991 or 2 when I saw Mark Burns walk through an NCECA convention center dressed in chaps and in all of his beautiful glory, and I thought that was the first time I ever felt like there was a place at NCECA for someone like me outside of a heteronormative culture. There was a place within the ceramic community for all of us. Fast forward to last year, I was absolutely moved to tears when I saw queers and friends of all colors dancing on stage after Pepper Pepper's official Randall session, and I thought, I've entered a time warp. Oh my God, how is this happening? Today, it's so wonderful to see all of you beautiful faces gathered here to learn more about how these 5 artists approach themes of identity in their work. I ask you to join me in celebrating the fact that this is just one of many discussions, many panels, many exhibitions this year at NCECA that highlights all kinds of diversity, and really an attempt to bring inclusivity into the core of NCECA's values and also into our cities and towns and our communities online. I'll close with just one last short observation. In 2014, I had the great pleasure to curate an exhibition titled Sexual Politics at Gender, Sexuality, and Queerness in Contemporary Ceramics at Northern Clay Center in Minneapolis. And I'm happy to have gotten to know Ron Geibel through that exhibition and to be able to work with Kathy King, who I've known for years and have respected her work for such a long time. I got to invite my dear Dusty to exhibit alongside Mark Burns, which was like the gay ceramic dream for me. And today I have this great joy of meeting Marvel A. Rex and Maya Vivas, 2 artists that I hadn't met before today. Just 4 years ago, when I was curating that show, I looked for voices like yours, and I knew they existed, but I couldn't find them. And it's such an honor to have you here today, because your voices are absolutely critical to the whole conversation. As an artist and an educator, it's energizing to see how this conversation has grown and how we all shape the future of NCECA and the ceramic world. And I just say happy New Queers Eve, y'all. Thanks.
Wow, thanks, Kelly. And thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see this great crowd, half of this great crowd here in the room. We're going to start with just having the panel introduce themselves.
Okay, I am Ron Geibel, and I'm here from Georgetown, Texas. So, show of hands, who actually knows where Georgetown, Texas is? Okay, fantastic.
My name is Marvel A. Rex. I am in a liminal space between the East Coast, West Coast, and Salt Lake City, Utah. And my pronouns are he, him, they, them, depending on any moment.
Hello, my name is Maya Vivas. I'm an Afro-Latinx artist. My pronouns are they, them, and I am based out of Portland now, Portland, Oregon.
Hi, my name is Kathy King. I'm a director at the Harvard Ceramics Program and also a studio artist in the Boston area, and my pronouns are she, hers.
Thank you. I'm Dustin Yeager. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. My pronouns are he, him. We are here for a 90-minute discussion session. So we have some topics for conversation among ourselves, and then we're planning to have time to chat at the end with all of you. I hope you'll feel like we keep this pretty informal and that we create a safe space for you all and your neighbors to share some sharings, ask some questions, and feel your feelings through the panel. Talking about work that explores and contextualizes queer identities bridges academic conversations and innately personal experiences. While I had been making work about queer experiences for a couple of years, it was probably at the Milwaukee conference in 2014 when I met Ron that it occurred to me that I hadn't actually talked about the act of making and showing that work with another queer man. And that connection with Ron made the work so much more real and emotional for me in my own studio. A year ago, when Ron and I were discussing the idea for this panel, I was drawn to the way philosopher and cultural critic Jose Munoz ascribes meaning and consequence to daily activities and queer identities. Munoz's contributions to cultural theory directly address queer experience in the world, both as a subject, particularly as a queer man of color, and as an audience member to various performances on the stage, the screen, television, and the club. Drawing on examples of drag queens, of out gay men on reality TV, and fantasies or realities of boundless intimacy, from the terror of the AIDS crisis to the tumultuous landscape of 21st century queer issues, Munoz is adamant that our daily experiences and performances as queer people are essential to building a more open society and as valuable to the critical discourse as academic essays, films, or artworks. For Munoz, living a queer experience in or out of the public eye is an act of artwork and activism, filled with poignancy, pleasure, beauty, and urgent work. He suggests that we imagine a future centered on queerness of all kinds, and that future is here today and comes into being through our enacting it. Our panelists today each make work where their queerness is legible in overt and coded ways, featuring the body, political statements, intimate experiences, the sublime, and pop culture. We navigate issues of exposure and vulnerability by making this aspect of our experience public through depictions, metaphors, and objects. I want to use Munoz's queer futurity as a frame. How do our careers as artists march towards this queer futurity? That is, a future fully centered on and organized around queer experiences and aesthetics, so much so that queerness as a category might even cease to exist. We'll discuss issues of coding and legibility, the boundaries of what we choose to expose or conceal, as well as how we started making work about our identities and experiences. The slides that have started rolling behind us are about half our own work and half artists who have inspired us by conjuring, living in, or pointing towards their own perfectly queer utopias. We will also share images of other clay artists who make work directly about their queer identity or experience, with a preemptive apology to anyone who I might have neglected and left out. We also want to acknowledge in a major way the queer artists who are not on the panel, but some of whom have laid the groundwork for our successes by taking enormous risk in the 70s, 80s, and earlier. These artists put visibility on the map through their works, through their presence at exhibitions and gatherings like NCECA, as Kelly mentioned, and their legacies through their students across the country. As we celebrate and push the growth of our visibility at this time, the ease with which we address identity and social problems, we stand on their shoulders in Pittsburgh and in our own communities and studios. So as we start to think about what it meant for those artists to put these ideas on the agenda years ago, we can start by talking about the ways that these artists make queer content legible and coded in your own work. The questions I want to start with: how important is it that your work be read as queer? And what kinds of content or imagery are you interested in using? Maya or Kelly, I think, Kathy, you wanted to start.
I think for my own work, and being the elder lesbian on the stage here, I've had more time at it. I have friends in this audience, of over 20 years, and some of you have known me as straight identified, bi identified, and lesbian identified. And in the same way that in my own life, my sexuality has been fluid and has changed, so has that topic within my work. First and foremost, my work has been about women and empowerment. And as I have grown more mature, so have, I think, the ways that I empower myself as an artist to begin to speak beyond the general women's issue, but now to explore more of the gay strand within the work. My work is very autobiographical and personal, and though it's not always to the minute, when I was in school, I had a classmate sit with me at a bar after a crit, and he was like, "What are you going to do? Just make work about your body and who you've slept with till you hit menopause?" And I'm like, "I hope so." and I'll tell you, I won. So I think I feel, as a older woman, being more empowered to use it within my work, to use those issues within my work, and then also take it upon myself to be aware of other artists, which is why I'm so honored to be on this panel.
Great, thank you. I find the works that I find most interesting are the ones that hold a level of ambiguity, and I'm not necessarily interested in making representational work. I find a lot of beauty and a lot of freedom in making works that are more abstract, that can be appreciated on multiple planes. There is a certain level of me relating my own body to the clay body, and so in that way I'm able to tell my narratives and display movement and change and growth. But I'm not overly concerned with my work being read as queer right away. Yeah, it's not something that is a super high priority. But if people are interested in navigating and like asking me further about my work, they're gonna know.
So my ceramic work definitely has, I think, two distinct phases from my own perspective. I kind of have work before I transitioned, and then I have work after I transitioned. And the work I made before was a lot more abstract, and it felt like more emotive and personal to me, and was kind of read more of what Maya's saying, in the sense of I didn't care if it was read as queer. I didn't care what other people thought about it as much. It was for myself. And then after transitioning, I think my work is pretty overtly read as queer now. I had a friend, kind of going back to what Kathy said, where they were like, "Are you going to make this work until you hit menopause?" Well, I had a friend tell me, "Are you really going to make work about dicks? Like, right? You're going to make work about dicks until you go to grad school. I hope you stop making work about dicks." And it's funny because the work that's the most provocative and interesting to me that I'm making right now centers around the dildo. So I will continue to do that, and I might continue to do that for the next 50 years, and that would be great. I feel fine with that. So yeah, I think my work does overtly read as queer right now, and I'm very interested in pushing that until perhaps the identity of queerness changes or dissolves. I'm okay with there being sort of a re-understanding of categories.
And I fall into, I would say, the category that Maya was talking about, where it's not necessarily read as queer. Like the legibility is a little bit, I think, unclear. I'm really thinking of ideas of kind of gender, sexuality, identity in general. And I work with, I reference a lot like ideas of like intimate objects and that idea of taking what might be perceived as private into the public realm, but doing that in a way that kind of disguises it. And I like to think of this idea of sort of enticed by craft, where I'm working in a way that I think perhaps the appeal of the way that I'm working, or the way that I'm using the multiple, and that obsessive way of repeating one form after another, kind of draws folks in without necessarily understanding what it is they're looking at. So I often think of the way we kind of draw folks into that conversation, where it's like you can be kind of like very bold and in someone's face, and that's absolutely an avenue. I just don't think I'm good at that.
Yeah.
So I like to think of ways that I can kind of open the door for the conversation without folks realizing that they're entering into that conversation.
Being enticed by craft is something that what you just said like resonated with me. Yeah, because I often have people being like, I want to touch it, I want to put my hands on it, and so that also plays into my ideas about ownership and feeling like you just have so much liberty with the feminine, because my work is very feminine. So I have people being like, I just want to people have said like really weird, rude things about my about my work, about how they want to penetrate in all sorts of ways, and I'm like, maybe you should examine your entitlement around femininity.
Interesting. Interesting.
Thank you. A follow-up to that I think kind of blends into this next question. So as we were talking about this panel in the fall, one of the things that got the most response from you all was talking about issues of boundaries, of how do you choose what part of your identity or experience to put into your work, and how do you choose what not to put there. And I think that comes back to how your work can be read as queer, is what kind of content or imagery you're using. And some people have mentioned, you put layers of meaning into the work, that some of which are just for yourself. I do the same thing. So I'm curious how you choose the icons and the imagery that you use. As you answer and you think about boundaries and what you do, I'd be interested in kind of unpacking the content of your work a little bit more as well. Ron.
Okay, back at the mic. So I had someone make a comment to me a while back about looking at sort of my work over the years and how the location kind of changes the way that I approach the work, which I never really thought about too much. And I started making work about gender and sexuality and identity while I was living in Montana, which might seem like somewhat of an odd fit, but I think we're unpacking that a bit later, so I'm going to hold off on that. But I felt like the work there was much more direct and in your face, because I felt like the conversation needed to be that way, at a point where I wanted to sort of like ruffle some feathers, if that makes sense. But then moving to New York and having a shift where that conversation was much different, where there was not maybe an easy enough platform for the shock and awe. So I felt like using the multiples in a way to kind of disguise was really a way to enter into that conversation again without really being too kind of obvious or direct. But now I'm switching into, I've been doing an ice cream cone series that I'm referring to as Lick, which is trying to think of ways that kind of intimacy and scale come into play, also the way you consume or hold an ice cream cone and consume and eat an ice cream cone. And just looking at, if you Google any images, it's like they get very like oddly sexual very quick. But thinking of how that can also become a way to think of how this idea of luring someone in and enticing someone to this temptation where you're drawn to the object because it's familiar, kind of the same way that maybe pop art works in a way, where drawn in, but then again kind of slowly revealing. And I have this sort of mission of kind of making the ice cream cone the new banana in the sort of like queer realm, and using that image. But yeah, it's...
Go ahead.
Going off what Ron said, that perfectly works. I think with my work, I use my body as a seductive force and sort of a manipulative device in a way. And then I'm really interested in sort of, there's a long legacy of this within queer work, but I'm interested in sort of sexualizing what's read as like the male or the masculine body, because the female body and femme is highly sexualized and consumed by can be consumed by everybody. But if I start to posit my own body and sexualize my own body, that can sort of disrupt a lot of the paradigms around the really unbalanced paradigms understanding masculinity and femininity. So yeah, I definitely, within my work, am interested in pushing all the boundaries, especially around masculinity and how masculinity is understood.
And I guess I'm kind of the opposite of that. I feel like just navigating the body that I have every day, like it's assumed that my body is just made available for consumption at all times. And through my work, I'm already in a place of vulnerability. So when it comes to breaking down my work to other people and deciding how much I wish to reveal and what my boundaries are in that, I like to be very selective on who I open up to and share that with. And I think maybe some viewers just need to like sit with the fact that my work might not be for them, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think because my work is more closer in alignment to, say, a graphic novel, and using the kind of iconography of like pinups and kind of the types of images of women that make you think about objectifying women. I try and flip that in a way to talk about something beyond that, or talk about empowerment, or how the female form that you're looking at decides to reveal certain things and conceal other parts of their life. And that makes me think about, starting out, making work and kind of entering into showing work and whatnot, that I had this idea that, similar to how I thought about my own sexuality, that I could make work about anything. And what I found out early was that if I made work about reproduction or deciding to have kids or not, then I was, assumed to be one thing and labeled. So like Paul Mathieu's book, Sex Pots, when that came out in '93, he commented that I was the straight female version of Matt Nolan, who is a mentor of mine, but that that cut me to the quick. It was like the first time to be like outed. It's like, no, that's my job. Like, you didn't ask me, what I am, or you don't even know me. And so it was based on the content of the work. And I think because of the work that I do, I felt like, okay, I've got to be smart about this, or at least be able to let something roll off the back if someone's going to make assumptions about my personal life based on the work. And so that's been a ongoing struggle, and I try not to care. I try to be bold. I can't say I am bold. I can't say that I'm pushing all the boundaries. I just try. Yeah.
Do you feel like that's changed significantly in the last 10 years? And,
Absolutely.
And to everyone else, have you had similar experiences in your career?
Absolutely. I think, I'll just end with my comment that I am so encouraged that the labels are less sticky. It's like, to be, when I was a kid in the 90s, to want to identify as bi at that day, like that was dating. Oh my God, you weren't going to date anybody, and the saying, pick a team, is one of my most hated sayings, because it was said to me so often, so I'm encouraged that seems to be less of a issue, so you're welcome. Like I did it, like, yeah. Go ahead.
Wait, what? Like pick a team? Or are we
No. The question about boundaries.
I feel like I said basically everything I need to say about regarding boundaries. Yeah.
But I will say I like the idea of how folks read the work, because I've had a handful of comments over the years in the way that I work, and also the scale where I was at an opening in Houston, and someone had come up to me after, without realizing I was connected to the piece, and once I said which piece was mine, they were convinced that a man didn't make that piece, and I was immediately kind of excited for this conversation, but I think the way my excitement came out was that I was slightly offended. But I wasn't at all, but I love that conversation, because I was so curious as to why it would be read that way. But for them, it was because it was, I think they used the kind of classic terms of the scale being more smaller and intimate, and also the very delicate approach in the way that the construction was kind of happening. But I think the scale and the way that plays into it is very interesting as well, where something that's on a much smaller scale is often read as feminine or more intimate, where male masculinity, it's larger, it's more public, so that line is always very interesting, and how to sort of toe that line as you're making work, but just to really be aware of it, I think.
I think setting up the panel and thinking about having a panel about sexuality, sexual issues, sex pots, one of the questions we needed to address, or would be expected to address, is eroticism and the body and sexual partners, genitals. Are there times in your career when you've used that? What's your approach to that? How do you feel about the role of explicitly erotic subjects in your practice?
I will definitely answer that question. I am more so now getting into eroticism across media. So whether that's film, video, collage, painting, ceramics. I think clay is a very sensual medium. I don't think that I wouldn't argue that. So I've definitely had a relationship where, especially with my video work, where I'm naked with clay, it's a very intimate moment, and there's always this line between I don't want to hypersexualize my experience because that sort of captures it, and doesn't allow for a spaciousness or like a large spectrum of experience. But I am interested in using sexuality and sort of leaving. I want to create space within my sexuality, and art allows for that. Ceramics allows for that in a lot of ways. And let's see, I lost my train of thought, but I do use it. I use it particularly to. I want the audience and myself to sort of come to a place where they feel okay thinking about their own sexuality, and regardless of how you identify, regardless of where you are on your journey and your adventure, just feeling okay and having your own space, your own personal space to look at your sexual preferences, to look at things beyond the categories we've been given.
I agree that clay is a very sensual medium. I mean, you spend a lot of time, like we call it a clay body. It's a body. Your hands are on this body. There's a push and pull. There's a conversation that you're having within the clay, and that conversation. When I'm in the studio, I'm having that conversation with the clay, and there are like high levels of like sensuality and femininity within my work, and I think people recognize that. And I've had somebody come up to me like being like, "Is that a vulva?" You know, and so I'm like,
Where here? Where?
what do you think? So yeah, it is there explicitly, and then also maybe not so much, because people, it kind of like, I like my work to kind of ride that line to being like, is that a vulva, or is that ocean waves, or is that tree, whatever, you know what I mean? So I am interested in that. I'm interested in walking that line between explicit and maybe not so much explicit.
Yeah, and I can't consider that I've explored the erotic. I think I'm my style and my method of making and surface is a little ham-handed, and then to pair that with the humor that I incorporate as a vehicle to have people enter into the work, I don't think that that's been something that I can say I've really pushed or explored. It's depending on how we're defining, the eroticism of it, just the idea of thinking about or portraying something within a sexual nature. There's an eroticism, I suppose, for some, but that's not the number one goal there.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Speak up.
I will say it's not something that I think too much about, but I do feel like it comes through like after I've made a piece and I'm looking back at the work. So especially with the Lick series and the melted cones, like I am thinking a lot about when I'm applying this, like the slip and having it run down the side, thinking of bodily fluids in the way, say like sweat drips off of kind of the bridge of your nose. So thinking of how if I make that drip happen in a way where the slip kind of just hangs right over the edge, and the way that can all of a sudden become erotic just in that kind of pause or that moment where it's like holding on to that drip. And I think there are little moments within the work, but I'm not necessarily thinking about it too much while it's happening. It oftentimes gets pointed out afterwards, because I think it is kind of hard to define like how you sort of perceive the erotic and how that kind of plays into the work. But it's one of those things where oftentimes you kind of realize certain things are happening because someone else is pointing it out after the fact. Yeah.
Tell me more about the ways you stage the engagement with your works. So you mentioned humor, you've mentioned craft, you've mentioned sensuality. How do you build a mechanism that people can engage with your work?
I think for me, like one of the most influential medias to look at for me were graphic novels, and there's within that I think I was looking at my major influences within ceramics, but then looking outside of that, what I was trying to look for was an honesty, and that kind of honesty. That's the, go ahead and look inside my medicine chest cabinet and check out what pills I have kind of moment. And, a rawness to it. And I found that with different artists like Julie Duché, who's not really publishing as much anymore, but she's a Berlin artist who did a series called Dirty Plot. And seeing that kind of work, I think alongside with like Sue Williams or Nicole Eisenman, whose images are going past here, like that kind of rawness to me was impactful. And I wanted to be able to put that standard to myself and to say, to at least be as honest as possible, even though it may be embarrassing, that it could come back on a judgment of my own personal life, but to try again to be brave in seeing what happened when I did that. I remember the worst attempt at that ever, and I don't think anybody has seen this piece, but I did a piece in Atlanta when I was teaching at Georgia State at a local wonderful gallery signature shop, and I had decided to map on the wall through different wall plaques of everyone I had ever had a sexual encounter with, and then try and figure out how one person led to the other person. And so, everybody was up there, and I added fun facts about their bodies or their genitalia. And I remember it was kind of a shocking opening night. And because it just struck me, I was like, it was the first time I had made something entirely for me. There was no way anyone would ever purchase this. Like, absolutely no way. So, is that, when you go to the place of like artist therapy or whatnot, that's often considered like a self-therapy, but there's something about my need to put it out there, to be kind of like, is anybody, like, do you connect? Do you have a story like this? And that's like a almost maniacal need of mine as an artist.
Maybe it's because where I am in my journey or career, but I'm like kind of in this like selfish phase right now where I'm not really thinking too much about how people engage with the work. And I think it's because, I know what it is. It's because I recently just started showing and like seeing people's reaction to my work and being like, oh, there are feelings outside of my own feelings about my work. And so it's really interesting to see the pieces that resonate with people and beginning to share my story and seeing what people pick up on and what people decide not to attach to. And when people view the work, saying how sometimes like my work will like trigger a memory with somebody, and then they'll have the need to like share that with me, and I'll be like, whoa, this is like not something that I would ever connect to my own work, but I also find that really fascinating. So I think I'm still in the process of figuring out how I want people to engage with the work and receiving the engagement that people are giving me in response to my work.
So in regards to this question around like mechanisms we use to have people engage with the work, I definitely use humor. I think about Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. She talks about serious blasphemy. And I think about, blasphemizing something is to sort of degrade it, but I use humor in the way that I use humor to blasphemize in a lot of ways. And I like to sort of poke fun at myself too, because when I poke fun at myself in the ways that I'm doing it, I'm also poking fun at masculinity and tropes around masculinity, and I'm poking fun at tropes around gender. I'm poking fun around tropes around the body, surrounding the body, and even social media and how much we take our ego seriously, we take our story seriously. And Marvel A. Rex, like the way that I introduce myself as a character that I've produced, and I'm aware that I'm performing. The moment that you have to like come out, I think, at least for myself, I realize that everyone's performing, and then I'm deciding to exploit that. So that's a lot of what I use. I use humor, and then, but there is a seriousness to my humor. I do take what I do really seriously, and I'm also simultaneously poking fun at everything I do. And as a queer person and growing up in Salt Lake City in the 90s, I used humor to protect myself, and I used humor to have sort of the normative society accept me to some degree. They could accept me because I was funny, but I didn't fit anywhere else. So I think I still hold on to that in my work because it's a legacy of mine. And then there's moments where also I think humor is not appropriate. But I'm also interested, while I say that, I'm also interested in pushing the boundary of where we're comfortable using humor. And I will continue to explore that through my work.
I definitely play off of the humor and think of sort of this playful humor in the way that I can be almost inconspicuous with the approach. And again, that goes back to the multiples and working where it's kind of disguising. And again, it's opening the door for a conversation without folks realizing they're actually entering the conversation. And we all know how humor works, right? It's like anytime you have to have a difficult conversation, like making someone laugh is always an easy way as an entry point. And I think when I was finished with grad school in, I think it was 2013, I was doing my first like little visiting artist deal, and I was making work at a school in southern Louisiana. It's a very conservative town, and I was there all week making a piece, and I was making these topiaries that were kind of this idea of like, picture perfect, like the facade in front of a house where it looks like it's well groomed and this picture perfect idea, but we really don't talk about anything real like behind the closed doors. And as I was there all week working, there were certain folks that were taking the course that were so into the work. They were asking lots of questions, mainly about process. But we had so many engaging conversations. And then the second I gave the lecture, and I have a few slides where there's all these intimate objects. And because like awkward scenarios are one of my favorite things, it's like you let that pause for a second, right? And you kind of like talk about some other things and let that linger for a second. But in that moment when I started talking about coming out and how this work falls into that inconspicuous nature of drawing folks in, people were leaving, and the folks that were leaving were the same folks all week that were having those conversations with me and that were into the work. And the second something was revealed, all of a sudden they were no longer into it, and I didn't see them again the rest of the week.
Whoa.
And this sort of lingers back to, I recently had a question of like, who's your audience, which I think is a really great question, but a tough question. And for me, there's two different kind of audiences where it's like that for me is the audience, like something like the fact that you got up and left because something now all of a sudden is revealed about yourself. You're uncomfortable knowing this information that you didn't know before. That's a different audience, and for me, that's an audience where I can start that dialogue as opposed to, the audience that may want to purchase the work, which is probably not that same group. But
Oh man. Oh, sorry. I just had a thought around. Okay, I had a thought around who the work is for and who is purchasing it, and who has the means to purchase it. When we think about the people who hold positions of power and the people who hold wealth and things like that. Like I have a series in black clay, in which I am sculpting my own internal organs, and where I'm sculpting my own internal organs, and they are black, and they're hung, and they're for sale. And so, what is suggested in all of that, and who has the ability to purchase those things, traditionally speaking, it would be, white male people buying pieces of my black body. So when we're thinking about the difference between who is this for and who is purchasing it, those are things that I think about a lot.
I want to call back to the Munoz queer utopia concept, and I'm going to jump ahead in our own little roadmap here and talk about, I know, surprise. Talk about your goals, right? If the goal is to create work and put it in the world and begin conversations towards building this queer utopia where our work and our presence and our bodies are fully accepted and valued, what are the goals for each of you as an artist or activist, for how your work pushes towards this?
Go ahead. Okay, so I think when we're thinking about things in terms of queer utopia or liberation in general, something that I can't avoid is where my blackness intersects with my queerness. And so if we are going to speak in terms of liberation or utopia, we have to include not only the queer folks in general, but queer people of color. So, I mean, my resolving, the ways in which I tried to resolve my frustrations around this was opening a gallery, which I've done with my best friend over there. Hey. So my gallery is Ori Gallery. You can find us online at oriartgallery.com. How's it spelled? ORI. Yeah. And so what we do is we focus on queer and trans artists of color and try to uplift those voices. So I'm very much in the here and now, trying to get whatever little piece of institutional power I can and create those spaces for my community.
Awesome. Yeah, that's sort of, my mom has a saying that's called creative maladjustment, which is sort of entering into institutions of power that are usually run by like white cis men, and finding a way to be maladjusted while still kind of tricking them, that, you know, and therefore creating space for people that don't have as much of a voice or need a voice. In relationship, I kind of spoke to this earlier, but what I'm interested in doing is destabilizing white masculinity. Yeah, and specifically, like, definitely the concept of the white cis man, and then everything built around that. So I have a project going on called it's called Gode Tech or Dildo Tectonics. There's a lot of different names for it, but basically I'm dildo bombing bronze sculptures in every city that I go to. Because who makes bronze sculptures? Who gets to put those sculptures in public spaces?
Who are those sculptures of? Sorry.
Who are those sculptures of?
Sorry.
And I shouldn't even say sculptures. I think the right word and a more interesting word is monuments. And there's a lot of issues right now in the United States around monuments, so that kind of spurred the project. And I'm interested in positing this like pink sort of semi-translucent dildo on these like bronze sculptures, thinking about medium and material. And then also, yeah, really trying to destabilize who is in power, and trying to create more space. And also, I love to piss people off, so this is really great. And I'm trying to piss the right people off, basically, is what I'm trying to say by that. So yeah, that's what I'm really interested in doing. I want to destabilize concepts around white masculinity.
I'm just thinking for myself and where I am in my life is that to kind of have the time and the field and a platform to be able to support other artists and to be able to, try and keep the conversation going by providing, looking for people who are interested in going beyond the norm to come do residencies and lectures and workshops and to keep that conversation, because I'm in a very big, well-known place, that's trying very hard to be open, and but I see so much work to be done. So, my little voice from the ceramics program at Harvard, you got to do what you can do. But that's probably my goal, is to help others. Mm-hmm.
And I think, Kathy, that's one thing that I think in our response to the questions you and I had in common, because I'm finding myself in that spot now in my third year in academia and teaching, and I find it's interesting to kind of toe that line, because Texas is a conservative state, surprise, but I had so many questions before I moved there from New York, because it's like when you're in New York, you don't go anywhere else. So, but then also saying that you're moving to Texas, there's all of a sudden this caution, like, well, based on the work that you make and the conversations that you want to have, is that really the best place? And then does the system, does the school support that? And it's like, of course they do, or I wouldn't be there. And I do feel that new level of responsibility where it's like, how do I have those conversations and create that environment within the classroom where everyone's welcome, feels comfortable to ask questions and to make work that's going to be somewhat controversial or like discussing difficult topics. And the first few times I had to deal with that, where I'm always pushing, and this was, I think, in the first year that I was there, and I'm always like pushing something about social, political, like, let's have a conversation that's outside of just the kind of the medium and the craft. And I had a student pause and ask, well, you always push us to make this work, but how is an ice cream cone doing that? and the gentleman that works with me, it's like just kind of sat back and crossed his arm and got this big smile on his face, like, now how do you navigate this? And I was a little nervous to approach it, but I just was like, well, if I kind of conceal any of this now, I was doing a disservice, right? Like my studio's there, they see that I'm working, so I can't not have that conversation. So I just like laid it all out there, and everyone was like, "Oh, okay, cool, next." And I'm like, "Wait, there was no conversation because they were just all fine with that." But I do think, every so often you get those folks that are not, and I've had questions that are difficult, but my main goal is this, to create that space where that's okay. And that's kind of outside of my own work, and I hope those conversations are happening. But sometimes it's hard when you send work out because depending on how it's read, like maybe, especially working in an inconspicuous way, like maybe that conversation's not really happening based on what they're looking at. So I feel that responsibility to make sure that conversation's happening, in the classroom.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. I mean, to be able in 20 years or so of teaching, like to go from the classroom structure has changed in how you get to know students, because now I'm hoping in most educational facilities that you might be from or associated with, that your instructor is asking for pronouns first. And what I think that has done has opened up a way to get to know people first, your students as people. And it's like this, it had this wonderful additional kind of opening the door to like getting to know you as not just your name, not just your pronoun, but who you are. It got like everybody. It got me to slow down and kind of enjoy people instead of like, well, I hope I can remember that person's name and by next class. It's like, okay, automatically I'm getting to know the students better that first day and right off the bat and building a relationship. So I think that change to being more aware of how people want to identify within the classroom structure has improved my experience teaching.
One of my favorite questions I've ever received was after a lecture on a project, and someone raises their hand, they ask a question about the fact that, great, you show us a lot of images and that's helpful, but a lot of the examples are more feminine, and can you show us more masculine examples? And I think, I had to pause for a second, and I looked down and I was wearing a pink cupcake apron, so I was like, well, I don't know. Think about that for a moment. But the fact that, there's a lot that could have been unpacked there, but I did not feel like that was the moment it needed to happen. It's like you felt comfortable enough to ask, like, okay, like I recognize this and we can talk about it. But in that moment, I didn't quite know how to handle it. And I also felt like if I kind of pushed and had this person kind of unpack that, it was putting them on the spot. So I kind of used that as a way later to bring those topics up in a way that wasn't putting like said person on the spot. But it was, I did look back through later and I'm like, okay, I could see how maybe you feel that way, but.
I think the question I've wanted to ask, and I've struggled to find the way, is like there's so much shit we deal with. Like, why are we all making funny work? Why are we all smiling and laughing at all? And I don't think I have the question about this, but I just want to like mark your responses to this. And part of this stems from feeling. Ron, I know you and I have been interested in like the ACT UP work and activism and like work that's filled with rage coming from earlier generations, and thinking, where is that now? Is that the way that we need to be making it? But in thinking about this question and this particular part of the conversation, Marvel really helped when you said, well, it's not an either or. Like, you don't have to be humorous or full of rage, but it's a strategy of both and, that you can use these things strategically. So I think in this particular part of the conversation, I've really been struck by the ways that we're building different segments of this queer utopia, right? Ron and Kathy talking a lot about the social support structures that can enable people to live their fullest lives. And at the same time, Maya and Marvel talking about like destabilizing, right? Destabilizing and grabbing the power. And I think those things coming together are what can push us into that. That's all part of the futurity and the steps that we take to get there. So if there's responses to that, you're welcome now, or we'll move on.
Well, and I think humor comes out in a lot of, Dustin, I think what I hear you saying is like, there's a lot of humor infused into queer work, or it can be. And I think that for from my first response to that is I spent a really long time severely unhappy and like suicidal, and I think that's not necessarily like a singular experience, especially for queer folk, especially for people of color, especially for people who do just feel like they're not recognized on a daily basis / oppressed on a daily basis. So humor comes out for me as like a mutative tool, and then also as a way to kind of help like self-soothe, and as a way to empower myself, all those things. So I do think that perhaps that's why it is a little bit maybe more common for humor to come in, and it helps me feel a little bit more in control. And I have also used it as a protective tactic as well. And that being said, though, I'm all for work that's angry. A lot of for me, a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, I think has an underlying sense of like my frustration and my anger and wanting to destabilize, but also I want to use humor because, as Ron said, it sort of tricks the audience a little bit. It's like a door that opens because people are kind of laughing, or they think it's an open way to approach the audience, and then as the audience comes in, I can sort of be like, by the way, I really need you to fucking think about this for a second, and this and this. But I'm glad I got you laughing. So yeah.
I don't think my work is so much humorous, but I do want to talk about humor, but maybe also beauty. In a world and society when we are made to feel othered and not beautiful and not special, and I'm interested in creating my own beauty, and I'm interested in flamboyancy. I'm interested in abundance, and so I think I spend a lot of time thinking about how do I through these like metaphorical self-portraits or these like abstract self-portraits, how do I make myself beautiful?
Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, I will, I guess, think about a time in my life where I tried to work within my use of humor, but did try and walk in someone else's shoes. So in a piece that was about the LGBTQI community, to do an aspect of it that was based on a trans experience. And at the time, I was involved in this wonderful organization in Atlanta, Georgia, and I wrote grants for them, the Feminist Women's Health Center, which was primarily an abortion clinic, but also it had a trans initiative because many of the young transitioning people in Atlanta were getting hormones from, Shell stations and whatnot. And so to create a safe space for people to receive medical care and whatnot. And it was that experience of me actually putting myself in that conversation, to be close to people, to get to know people who were walking a really kind of, challenging path. Then I had to look at myself and be like, okay, this is not applicable. This is not mine, to approach it with humor. And not to say that I might not find a way that I felt comfortable doing, but I felt like I need to. I can't lump all the letters together. The LGBT. It's each one is an individual. Word, and there's so much behind it, and so educating myself and being involved in a community so that I could learn more about other people was important, and made me really think harder about what I'm choosing to use in my work. Mm-hmm.
And I want to respond to that and say, and kind of build off of what Kathy's saying, in the sense that I don't use humor in a place where I feel like I cannot speak. Like I use humor specifically regarding white masculinity, which I pass as a man all the time. So I feel like I can speak from that place, and I also think it's fair for me to sort of attack with humor that category. But I wouldn't necessarily go around using humor for other, just not from an experience that I don't know, and from people that don't necessarily marginalized communities. Like I'm really specifically using humor to destabilize something that I think needs to be destabilized, and holds a lot of power to begin with.
I think you introduced this topic as work that's sort of like filled with rage, maybe, or a bit more. I don't know if you were meaning like kind of aggressive in its approach, or can you?
What do you mean?
Well, whenever you were saying about maybe feeling like we are kind of split, where it's like some folks are maybe making or thinking of this idea of kind of the institution in the way that we might kind of foster these ideas, and then kind of breaking down the system. But you had mentioned work that's kind of maybe more like the ACT UP and the kind of filled with rage a bit, or the maybe political format that you're using. And I do think of this as kind of work that's really emotionally charged. And I think of like the Felix Gonzalez Torres work, where it's like the portrait of Ross and the candy piece, and how emotionally charged that is with the ideas of vulnerability, loss, and control, because there's such a narrative there. And it's also speaking of, it's like the AIDS crisis, and just so poignant. But I mean, sure, there's kind of rage behind that, but it's such an emotionally charged narrative that I'm always so drawn to that work because of the story that is attached to it.
Yeah, I don't know if I fully understand your question, but I think I've gone over it,
Yeah.
and I think I've kind of lumped it in like a pet peeve. Like, humor is a valuable tool, but we should all stop using it immediately because it does no good, right? Like, that's not a logical leap in my mind to take.
Takes all kinds.
Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about maybe going back in time a little bit, and have you tell some stories about how you started incorporating these queer themes into your ceramic work, into your output.
I had mentioned earlier about starting to make that work in Montana, and that's really where it all began. I went to grad school at the University of Montana, and that's really when I like kind of jumped out of the closet. And it's like, maybe Montana, again, not the best place, but it happens when it happens, right? It just felt like that was the moment, and that was the time that it needed to happen. So that was for me really where it started, and it all really started with kind of how you're delivering that news and feeling like, or always kind of putting folks in this somewhat awkward scenario and slightly maybe confrontational at times, or at least that's how it would be perceived, I think. But so much of that had to do with just the way that I was approaching that conversation, where my whole thesis exhibition was based off of this like handwritten letter to my folks, right? Like of delivering that news. And one good thing about writing the letter was it really guaranteed I would have that conversation in like 2 to 3 business days. I'm just kind of like wait that out and then gauge how that will go. But that's really where it started to happen. And thinking of kind of our influences, which I know we'll get to, thinking of ways that I look a lot at like photography and like Mapplethorpe and really portraits and that quick intimacy that you're kind of capturing in that photograph, and kind of thinking of those moments as I was telling the story. And a lot of that work that he was making of the Polaroids were happening at that time when he was trying to figure out himself. And I think that was really kind of poignant at the time for me as I was navigating, like making a 20-foot billboard with all of these like sex toys, where it's like maybe that is an awkward approach as opposed to a Polaroid, like spending a year making one piece that's really talking about this very significant moment. But it needed to happen, and I had to kind of work through that. But since then, it's always been kind of a theme of the work, but just kind of fluctuates depending on like the space. And now that I'm back in Texas, the work is less kind of obvious and confrontational, and it's using this sort of like sweet like temptation, this ice cream cone idea to kind of have that conversation. But yeah, the core of it all started in Montana, where that conversation was not necessarily easy, so I felt like it had to be a bit more confrontational, because I felt like I needed to take ownership of that in a way that involved kind of screaming, I think.
I was just confused, as a youth, and I had this idea that, I confused my sexuality with my hormones. So, if I was attracted to that person so I'm that, and if I'm attracted to that person, I'm that. And again, it was like kind of goes back to this world of labels that for whatever reason, was very kind of delineated in my mind, or that's what was coming at me. When I was 20 or 19 or 20, I went to Oregon for a summer and worked on a hazelnut farm and grew my leg hair, and came home to my parents' house, who had the whole family together, my little sister, and the book Knew Our Bodies Ourselves out on the table, and went into the intervention about, we know you're gay and we love you anyway. And this is a beautiful story, but that shoved me so far back in the closet. I was like, well, now it's not cool. No, or like, I was still, meanwhile, I was still trying to figure it out. I had no idea, And I'm like, well, now you guys are labeling me. I'm like, I don't know. So I think from that kind of confusion, and I'm just being totally honest. I'm sometimes confused now, and I'm 49, But, there's, at least now I feel more supported in that confusion, and that's okay, And I did not feel it was okay. So, again, it goes back to working with subject matter that I think it was almost like a note to the world, like, am I doing this right? Is this, what do you think about this? How'd this go? And so it's really interesting. I wish I had like I'd have friends with like these awesome coming out stories, or my wife who like was always putting time out in kindergarten for chasing after girls, and it's like I just wish like my story had been like more, just easier. But you know what? It's fine, and it's given me like a point of departure to at least to be more honest about that confusion. I definitely was not able to talk about it like I am now. I did a lot of work to be like smoke and mirrors, So again, with age comes wisdom.
I feel like I wasn't fully out into the world up until about, I think I came fully into my queerness maybe 3 years ago. So I always knew I was queer, but I was like kind of living in hetero land for a while there. And then I got out, and then I don't know. It's a story, but the short of it is I went through a breakup. I was in hetero land for like 5 years, and then I was homeless, and then I found this great community. I just happened to go upon this great community, and where everyone was queer, and everyone I talk to now is all my close friends are queer. And I think with that security came the freedom to explore my own like Black queer interiority, and to like have that fully expressed and come through within my work. And now it's all gay all the time.
Eileen Miles has this. She was interviewed by the New Yorker mag, and she talks about gender vacationing. And I really like this idea of gender vacationing. I feel like my life is just a perpetual series of coming outs. And not just, I don't even mean like to different people, I just mean like to everybody all the time. People, especially when you're transitioning, people are like, okay, now you're a man or now you're a woman. That's a pretty common thing that happens. And I'm just like, nah, dude, I am way too complicated for that. I go by what Eileen Miles says. I go by the idea that I'm kind of vacationing. I like to be in a liminal space, and especially if it provokes you, I'd love to be there even more. Because I think all the categorical understandings of it are pretty fixed and limit our experience, limit who we love, limit who we can be attracted to, and limit our artwork. I like to think that I'm kind of on vacation and that I will always be coming out, and I'm not necessarily confused about it. I actually like residing in a space where like you don't know my sexuality, you don't know my gender, but by not knowing it and not being able to place it, that frees me. I can kind of do whatever I want, and I do whatever I want. And as I get older, I think I'll continue to even expand more into what that means. And I hope that for everybody, actually. So, yeah.
Can we talk more about navigating that like in between space within gender,
Yeah.
and being like, when people want to know what's in between your legs, you know, when people are like, what are you a boy or a girl? They're like, what they're really asking is like, they're like, how do I treat you?
Yeah.
You know, they're like, do I treat you like a girl or do I treat you like a boy? And you know, and because those, I don't know, people get so stuck in those two modes of thinking that anything outside of that really, really throws people, and it comes out in anger, it comes out in violence, and you know, it comes out in like not just plain old like I won't accept that, you know. I don't know. So those are things that I think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you all. We're going to take a few minutes each and just talk about some of the images you're seeing, the artists and artworks that have inspired us through our various journeys.
So, I'm just going to start chatting about them because we're not necessarily at the images that we're talking about. So, when we were putting this together, we really wanted to throw artists in that we look at, for inspiration or for kind of like guidance and work that we look up to in some way. And I have been drawn to photography for some time, and I had spoke about this a moment ago, but thinking of like with Mapplethorpe, Robert Mapplethorpe is one artist that I have always been drawn to, and I think it's kind of towing that line between sort of this idea of masculinity and femininity. We have the images rolling through where it's like him presenting himself in the self-portrait as sort of the masculine version and the feminine version, and kind of the idea of towing that line and kind of being partly one and the other at the same time, and that not really mattering, and that's fine. And I really love the Polaroid series, the portraits, or I'm sorry, the Polaroids, where it's really catching this quick, intimate moment. And I think there's just a beauty in someone who's not necessarily realizing that the camera's there. There's a vulnerability that I find really appealing. And Collier Shore is another artist that I'm a big fan of, and I believe now she might do more kind of like fashion photography, but she has a series called Touched by Youth where she is kind of thinking of this idea of gender in flux and androgyny, where you're looking at an image where she's photographing boys to look like girls and vice versa, and going back to the way that I think of working in an inconspicuous way, where now all of a sudden you realize something about the image that you're looking at, the person that's in this image, and now all of a sudden you're coming to some realization about yourself and how you feel about this now that you realize something. So that, for me, is like a big influence in thinking of how the ambiguity plays. And then Felix Gonzalez Torres, conveniently enough, we're actually rolling through those images now. But the portrait of Ross, the candy piece, is something that I've kind of referenced for so long, and it's been a really powerful piece for me, just thinking of the time frame that it was made. If you don't know much about the piece, it's 175 pounds of candy, which represents kind of the ideal body weight, but struggling with AIDS, kind of losing weight and the loss and the vulnerability, as you're asked to take a piece of candy, but you're taking a part of the person, but as you take the candy, you're depleting the weight, so that the harmony of those two, I think, is so powerful. And also thinking of when it's made in the early, I think that piece was in maybe 91 or so. But at that time of asking someone to take a piece of candy from someone with AIDS and that's making work and talking about that, I mean, I think it's so powerful, and that it's emotionally charged in a way that an ice cream cone doesn't do that. But my experiences are different, and I think I'm okay with that, but it's always such a powerful piece to think of that vulnerability and the loss and the control, and that's, I think, something that we all kind of deal with on a daily basis. Is you were saying you were perpetually coming out, where there's always that vulnerable moment as you're kind of navigating your different environments, but yeah.
Should I just
Go for it.
Yeah. Or should we wait? Who did Nan Golden? Me and
No,
Nan said-
Marvel, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. So I chose. I also actually chose Robert Mapplethorpe, but I won't speak to him because Ron did that. But I chose Castles, who's a performance artist based out of LA, who has done a series of work with clay. then there will be images of them up. Yes, there's castles. And these are often endurance pieces, like this one where the clay or the ice is melting upon their body, and they hold that pose for the entirety of the ice melting. And this is the infamous clay piece that is shown around the world, where they attack a piece of clay in a dark room while the camera flashes on and off. So you just get snippets of them attacking the clay. This is them collecting their pee in New York, I believe, and talking. Often Castles talks about trans issues because that's sort of the body that they occupy. That is the body that they occupy in a way. And I chose people who kind of range, but Castles. I choose them for their courage and for putting their body literally on the spot. Performance art, I think, is one of the most vulnerable forms of art that you can make because you're doing it live. You don't know what's going to happen. There's not a lot of control. And Dynasty Handbag, who will be coming up, is also a performance artist based out of LA, and she uses humor. And whereas Castles doesn't necessarily do that much of an overt form of humor, but Dynasty does just very overt humor. And what I love about Dynasty's version of humor is that she actually holds something in LA called Weirdo Night once a month, where it's a performance space where I think there's kind of an open, you can perform if you want, and then there's a set series of performers. And I like the title Weirdo Night because Weirdo Night doesn't say, it's not even queer night or anything like that. It's anyone can perform from any background and any identification. And it's about being weird. And I think being weird is a vagary, but I think that there's a lot of power in it being sort of this openness and spaciousness to perform and be vulnerable with your body. So I mostly chose performance artists because I'm heading from ceramics. I'm kind of not departing per se, but I'm heading from a ceramics background into more of a performance space. So that's kind of why I chose them. I also chose Renate Bertelsmann, who's up right now, more of a sculptor, less of a performance artist, but I think did performance work as well. And I love I love Cactus, which is up right now, partially because there's a dildo being used for sure, but also I like repetition of form as well. So Renate comes up through repetition of form and sort of again talking about the body, but in a more not as overt of a way as like a performance artist like Castles or Dynasty does. So yeah, that's why I chose those folks.
My artist influences that I've chose today are Frida Kahlo, Kehinde Wiley, and Fujikasa Satoko. I chose Frida Kahlo because it was my first exposure to a queer woman of color who was an artist. My dad actually showed her to me, and I was obsessed. I found her work interesting because it was unapologetically based in a really deep personal narrative. She was very exposed. She used her own body, and she was unapologetically queer. I chose Kehinde Wiley because of his co-opting of masterworks and court paintings to paint the powerless as opposed to the powerful, kind of turning that on its head. He was using, what did we say earlier, technique as
Like enticing craft.
enticing craft. Yeah, ooh, I love that. It's unapologetically, there we go, garish and decadent and flamboyant and gay. And then Fujikasa Satoko, I chose her because of just the fluidity and the beauty and the precise way she captures a moment, and things are, which is something that I'm interested in. Is let's see, it's about trying to experience something that is in constant flux that you can only just trying to capture a moment in time, basically. Yeah.
And mine are kind of cycling through now, but I kind of thought of it in terms of my own entry into ceramics and kind of thinking about the first inspiration, which was, as Kelly talked about earlier, I went to the NCECA 1991, I believe, in Philadelphia, where Mark Burns was speaking, and that was the first time I had seen him speak, and I was just blown away. And it wasn't, we should also mention, because Mark had talked about it as well at that time, that he is a student of Howard Kotler's. And so being a student of Howard Kotler's, one of the more openly gay educators in our country starting from the 70s, and being able for Mark to be an out man himself, and then making this work that is so impeccably crafted. And I think it was just like that notion of just that ownership first of the craft and the art and what he produces, and being so this is exactly what I'm putting out there, and this is unapologetic, and I just was enamored. And then to peel back those layers and see and hear the honesty of his story and his journey, and not being able to have opportunities or jobs because of his sexuality, was something that was just blew my tiny mind apart. And then I think the next person is Matt Nolan. And so in the way that Mark inspired, Matt I observed, and I got to know Matt when I was a studio assistant at the 92nd Street Y in the mid-90s, and Matt came and did workshops, and at the studio he was a teacher there, and I just was so enamored of the different style that he had in terms of presenting information, where Mark is so bold and brazen, like Matt, with the same high level of craftsmanship, was able to talk about celebrating gay culture in social kind of situations in New York specifically, or you saw the Glitter and Be Gay vase or the prophylactics jar. I mean, that was amazing to me to see. I guess the way he presented it, to be able to take imagery and text together, to have a clear reference to a historical vessel such as an apothecary jar, and to flip that on its head. So that was really important to me, for me to see, and still to see now Matt's work evolve into a more, beautiful, abstracted sculptural direction. And I should also add that, my dream was fulfilled because I was able to have Mark Burns at our studio at Harvard this past year and a half, which was amazing, for not only to be able to be his friend, and he has mentored me throughout the years, but also to see him work as an artist up close, which we don't always get to do with those that we love. And then thirdly, George Bose, who was my educator, and he was at University of Florida when I went there for grad school, and Linda Arbuckle went on sabbatical replacement, and he was there, and just essentially kicked my ass up and down the street, because he is just unabashedly challenging. He is not messing around. He takes his job very seriously, and he is going to tell you exactly what he thinks. And it was the perfect moment. I just needed him in my life. And then more importantly, to see the type of work he makes, which at the time was very image-based, was very political. And what was spooky was that in asking George to get me some of those pieces, I picked from each artist mainly pieces that were highly influential to me at that time. George was responding from the Reagan-Bush era and the political situation of the 80s, responding during the 90s as well. And looking back on those and looking at them here, it's like, oh, damn, deja vu. It's like it's really timely. He worked with ideas of gun control and racism, and here we are, how many years later, and it's still really poignant work. And then later, within taking on his own queerness in his work, such as the white, it's a white plate that went by, and he sat and did a million glazed dots, clear glazed dots, and then it's revealed by the way he's applied it. Cocksucker will show up if you look at it from a certain angle. And I thought that work was so poignant, because it was a reveal conceal kind of moment. So anyway, I'm very, very thankful that I've been able to have these men in my life.
Thanks. We'll have a couple minutes for questions. There is a microphone in the center back of the room if you want to start lining up now, not all at once. I've avoided answering all the questions, but I'm gonna talk about the artists that I added to this slideshow as well. Starting with Kelly Knoll, who I met at Carleton. And I'd been coming out for about 18 months when Kelly was hired as the ceramics and metals professor. And over that first term, and then as Kelly's assistant during winter break, we would just sit there, and I remember pinching out little rabbit dresses for the work that's Rabbit Girl training cats. And I don't think I had any idea at the time how formative that would be in my life, sitting listening to Eminem and Tom Waits with Kelly in the middle of Minnesota, and feel like this additional connection. Kelly's from Montana and I'm from Wyoming, so we had this whole like queer Westerner. I added Pierre and Gilles because that's a pair of artists that I encountered around the same time who have this like glamorous aesthetic that I think can be so prevalent and damaging, but was something that I encountered at the time and clung on to, but also really appreciate the maximalist aesthetic in those photographs that are retouched with paint of the two men working together. And then Nan Golden, I think, really pursuing vulnerability to the max of showing absolutely everything from her life and the life of her communities. Okay, I'm going to stop there so we can have more time to talk with you all. Question?
Ooh, is that on? I don't think that mic is on.
Here's our man. Okay, that person.
Oh, nope.
Habana. Okay.
Ah.
I love that that you guys are so passionate about that vulnerability, and I admire that, and I would like to make work that is about what I think is important, right? I think that's something that artists want to do, but how do we do that and then make it marketable? Because when we do things about what we care about, then we have a very narrow audience. So how do we find that balance?
Well, in my opinion, I mean, you have to make it first. You know, you just have to make it. If you're already talking about wanting to do that, then you need to make that work, and then just be open to what happens to it in the world. You know, it's not necessarily just our work that is marketable or not marketable. It's kind of, you know, how we make the work, the places we choose, or work towards having it shown. It's a bigger package sometimes than just the work alone, so you've just got to trust that it's going to find its place eventually. So maybe your idea of like marketable might be, you know, one specific kind of like set of galleries or what you consider like making it, but just being open to finding that there may be an alternative space for the work that isn't necessarily maybe not a ceramic gallery.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of talking with Catherine Opie, and Catherine Opie took pictures at a time around like queer and dyke culture, where it wasn't like cool to be a dyke at all, and it was actually like kind of dangerous to be taking photos and like putting that out there. And what Catherine said that really affected me in relationship to your question is she said, follow your questions, make work about your questions, whatever, you know, take time to figure out what that question is perhaps, and then really follow it, and it will find a community, it will find an audience, because it'll be coming from a place that's really real for you and really authentic. And I don't think Catherine was taking photos at a time where she was like, I'm going to be world famous, but she knew she needed to take the photos, and now Catherine Opie is Catherine Opie.
Yeah, I think it's important to stick to your truth and make what you need to make, and not worry about the marketability of it, because it will find its place.
Go ahead.
Perfect segue. How many people in this room know who Catherine Opie is? Okay, that's pretty good, but it's still a problem. I just want to say that I completely appreciate that you are here. I'm here with you all throughout the entire thing because I know it's probably pretty unprecedented. I went to NCECA in 1984, I think, and ran screaming from the place and went directly into lesbian separatism and stopped making anything, which was wonderful. But what I find is that the context that you both speak about and show your work about is like historically challenged, because there's a whole lot of work that's made, clay or not clay, it doesn't really matter, that would speak to the kind of queer utopia that you quoted in the very beginning, that Jose kind of died for. And so it's almost like the intersection and queer and clay is severely limited, because if you're truly going to be queer and truly going to be liminal in it, you can't restrict yourself to clay, and you can't ask questions about saleability, because you must be in it for making meaning first, for representation or non-representation first. Like, you have the gift of representing or not, if you want. Like, I forget your name, but the woman who's talking about making body parts to be sold to. Maya, is it?
Yep. My name is Maya. Yes.
I just heard that and I cringed, because the scenario of that meaning is that it's so limited. It's like, I'm going to make my body parts and sell them to Beyonce. Fuck that. You see what I'm saying? It's like your
I'm not understanding what you're saying.
What I'm saying is, you only imagine selling your work, creating a false dichotomy of you having to make things to sell and only being able to sell them to a white man. That's what you said.
I'm speaking in terms of the probability of who is going to be purchasing the work.
No, I understand that. The probability is incorrect, though. You don't know that. Yeah. You're not imagining the entireness of the art world. You're only imagining a very specific part of the ceramics world.
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you for your question.
Okay. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does anybody here understand what I'm saying? No. Okay. It's just that it's not a mistake that this is happening 30 years after the movement. And I love that you're here, but if you're going to truly be queer, you must always also be queer in materiality and scope of the work.
Yeah, I think what I take from that is what we were hoping to expand with, including the influential artists, that we look outside of clay as well, for the kinds of artists and conversations that influence us. Yeah.
Okay, we have other questions.
Thank you.
Hi there. I have a sort of request for you guys. Do you have any advice that you would offer to queer makers here, or that might be viewing this lecture online later on, queer makers who are maybe either just starting their transition into their queerness, or are struggling with it, or are having to be closeted or hidden for whatever reason? I know, tough question, but sort of.
Well, it's not. I'll just add one small part of probably the answer you're looking for. But knowing your history and within who the artists that I've been talking about, we've all been talking about, that are clay specific, that there is a beauty to knowing that history, knowing the lineages, knowing people's stories, and then feeling empowered by that. There's nothing wrong with that. Of course, we're all looking at other materials as well and mediums, but I think how that impacts us as a field, which is why we're all here at this conference. comes out in different ways that these topics have to be taken apart bit by beat. It's not just this panel. It was Mac's panel last year. It was the panel that will happen tomorrow. It's the beginning, of a continued conversation. I'm going to stop there, but
Was your question about
advice on
starting out? I feel like I found a lot of safety in creating work that was more abstract. So if you find yourself in a place of like wanting to express yourself and not feeling safe enough to do so in creating work that is explicitly queer in order to cope, there's a lot of there's a lot of safety in working from symbolism.
Yeah, I can very much second that. I was making highly abstract work right before I started transitioning, so absolutely. And I think it'll read in a way. If that makes sense, that's kind of a vagary, but I think that it will read that your, how do I say this? Your queerness will come out. I don't know. It kind of feels weird coming out of my mouth, but abstract work can be an incredible tool because you can sort of you can kind of layer it with emotion, and that might help you get to a place where you feel more comfortable being more explicit. Also, you don't have to be explicit if you don't want to.
Yeah, I think you just trust yourself, and there's always folks around you that are kind of wanting to make similar work or wanting to talk about certain things that you're also interested in. So I think it's just trusting yourself and also not necessarily being concerned at first with how that work is perceived. It's like you don't have to talk about specifically what that work is dealing with if it's so personal. It's like let that kind of work itself out and then kind of move forward from there.
We've come up quickly on the end of our time, so we have to cut this a little bit short. But we are more than happy to continue conversations in the hallway. If anyone wants to gather around a table outside, we'll file out in a few minutes. Thank you all so much for this great chat.